I hate young adult and it needs to die. Let's talk about that. Hello YouTube and welcome to the Young Adult Crusade. In this series I will be reviewing bad young adult books I dislike and analyze the problems that they have that are also endemic to the genre as a whole. You see, I have quite a few strong opinions about young adult. I think it's lazily written, it's bad, and it's held to a lesser standard just because it's made for kids. And it shouldn't be. Young adult fiction is something that should be for the developing mind, something which you have before you are a grown-up. And some people extend young adult way into their 20s. And while it may be true that the themes are very particular to that age group, you can't really tell me that a 16-year-old is less human than a 30-year-old. We're all humans, basically, and we all suffer from the human condition, if you want to take an existentialist look at things. Or you could say we all share the same joys, which is also equally valid. What you can't do is divide humans neatly into sections and then say that, you need something very different from literature if you are just a dumb kid, and then, pander to their power fantasies. I think my problems with young adult warrant its own video, and it probably will be in its own video in the future. But for now, just know that I very intensely dislike young adult. I don't like the tropes of it. I don't like the flat and bland characters, and I'm going to illustrate this by reviewing a lot of young adult books that are very bad, at least that I think very bad. Let me of course preface this by a very general disclaimer. I do not want to discourage authors from writing by doing this. Critique, and it is a shame that I have to explain this in the year of our Lord 2020, but critique is meant to improve a work of art. So if I'm going to go in and tear down the walls and the very fabric of their story, then it's because the story is weak or is written in a weak manner, so I can actually tear it down this easily. You see, if I write a story, I want to have this particular very honest and open critique as well. So I'm not going to go into negativity or bashing, but sometimes the ideas being brought out are just so baffling that you can't help but wonder what was going on during the inception of this work of art. That being said, it's very important to understand what an opinion is. If you enjoy the books I review, then that's fine, more power to you. Maybe you haven't developed your critical faculties enough, or maybe I'm wrong. Whichever applies, there should be dialogue, open dialogue, about art. It is inherently subjective, and I wish no one ill who has actually achieved their dreams and published a book. You see, there's a lot of thought that goes into making and writing a book, so it can be quite jarring to have it fail, or seemingly fail in the minds of some critics, when your original intention differed greatly from it. And no one is born this awesome, competent world literature class writer. So in conclusion, I implore you to take great care in what kind of literature you read, but at the same time, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I think that goes without saying, but I said it anyway, and I spell it out for you to know that I'm not arguing from a perspective of ego. I don't like trashing things to feel better. I'm genuinely disappointed that young adult is being peddled to young adults, because I think it is in some ways harmful. It is harmful to blindly pander to the power fantasies of young adults who feel absolute powerlessness over the systems that harbor power over them. You just want to go in and smash everything with your half-baked idea of how the world works, and then young adult comes in and says, you know what? You are morally superior to every single one that came before you. You know best, and you have superpowers. You can do it whatever you like. And you know what? You should do that. I just feel like it's setting up young people for failure, because, of course, they don't have superpowers, and they're not vastly morally superior to everyone that came before them. And once they realize that, it might be more harmful than just educating them on how to act when they were young. And there is the argument to be made about young adult, that it's just simple, harmless fun. But then I ask you, why is the scope of these young adult books always this grand philosophical reimagining of the world. It might be fantasy, it might be a power fantasy, but it's not treated as such. It is less an exploration of humans and more an exploration of what would it be like if the world bended to the minds of children. But I'll save these and more arguments for future videos to come. Let's just dive right into it. The book is Scythe by Neal Shusterman. Scythe derives its name from its titular character, the Scythes, people who enforce death. We live in an imaginary future where death has been all but conquered. Human computation is so vast that every single logistical problem fathomable has been solved. Even death and pain. You have nanites in your bloodstream that dose out opiates when you get hurt, and they repair your cells if you get damaged. If you still manage to somehow die because you're just that dedicated, then you can be revived. Your body is being brought to a survival center. Everything is being watched by a benevolent AI. And I'm not going to derail this review even further by going into a rant on how people do not generally understand AIs. Let's just, take this postulated AI that is benevolent and all-knowing, all-powerful, and has changed humanity for the better as a given. I know that there are some problems with it, and I probably will reference back to this particular book, but for now, let's just accept this very premise. The main conflict arises from the fact that death has been vanquished, but people still need to die. They have not figured out a way to get to another planet. It's a catastrophe of a grand scale, even though I think if you possess the technology of nanites and an all-powerful AI that can repair human bodies, I don't think it would be too difficult to go to another planet. But again, let's not think about it too deeply. This is a recurring theme in young adult. You never think too deep about anything. Really, it's not meant for that. It's just just pandering to the lowest common denominator, and should be treated as such. Now, since Earth has finite resources, even though they are being redistributed, and poverty has been eradicated by means of superior logistics by the aforementioned AI, there has to be a set number of people that still die every year, because you just can't have everyone being immortal. Immortal, of course, the aging process is reversed by, it's called in the book, turning the corner. So you can just randomly get a new body. And then you live in this future where people don't die anymore. But people need to die because of resources. You can't just keep multiplying as humans. This is the premise of the book. And it's just really, really baffling. And I'm sorry that I'm not getting into the plot of the book. The plot is, of course, your general boy meets girl, and they love each other but hate each other at the same time, and then they're made by circumstance to fight against each other, but they don't want to because they actually love each other, but they kind of don't, that kind of thing. Our protagonist, of course, is 16 and 17, and they age over time. That is, of course, what I remember. Might be a bit inaccurate, but doesn't matter. For all intents and purposes, they could be 9 and 10, it doesn't matter, because they have the same moral sophistication. So what's the solution, you might ask, if people still need to die? There are scythes. Institutionalized death. Like the abstract representation of the medieval times, where a robed figure with a scythe comes in and kills people. By the way, it's not called killed, it's called gleaned. The scythes must always glean, although most of the time when I read this book, I just felt, can they not? Can they not glean? The scythe must glean. Kind of redundant, and we'll get into that. So, why? Why do you need people to kill other people? Murder them, essentially, in the legal way. Because of overpopulation. Because death has been solved. Well, the reason is actually quite interesting. You see, people distrust a benevolent AI that has improved their lives tenfold since forever and does a very, very, very good job. And even the revival of people is in the hands of the AI. So the people do trust the AI with their lives. They, however, do not trust them with their deaths. The Scythes is an old institution being brought forth so that they can hand-select people to die, and they do so at random. There's no set of rules or codes other than a quota they have to fill out, and they can't be racist. So they need to kill every race equally. So racism in the future is not a problem. You don't want some kind of white supremacist go around and killing minorities. That's a big yikes for the Scythedom. So instead of having an AI that can steer humanity perfectly, make very impersonal decisions and impartial decisions of who gets to die and who gets to live, or, even use a more fair system, like someone who has turned the corner, i.e. like made themselves younger like 5 or more times can eventually die. No, they just pick people at random. Could be a newborn child, could be someone who's 230. Doesn't matter, it's random. And it's random because people do the selection. And people need to do the selection because robot bias is going to take over, and you don't want to give a robot power over life and death, which is incidentally too late in the book, because the robot already has power over life and death, because he is again the one who revives everyone. And would he decide to not revive somebody, he would essentially kill them. And this is what happens with gleaning. The robot does not revive anyone who has been gleaned, i.e. who has been killed by scythes. So he makes an active decision. He gives the institution of the Scythedom the power to kill people, because people trust random hooded figures more than the AI that controls their every move in life. Let that sink in for a premise. And the entire book is just based around this, and people love it. They ate it up. Scythe has been a commercial success. People like the idea of that particular future. Of course, in the same breath, it's immediately criticized by our two awesome protagonists, who are, again, the morally vastly superior young high schoolers who get to be Scythe apprentices. And they, of course, immediately see the flaw in this particular system, that biases will always show, and that people shouldn't kill other people in gruesome and horrific ways just to solve overpopulation, which is a stupid idea to begin with. But they seem to be the only ones that see the problems and the flaws with this particular system. No great thinkers, no grown-ups actually understand the implications of such a system. I could go in and make this huge refutation of why this very premise is an incredibly stupid idea, but I think that would be a bit too exhaustive. First of all, as I have already mentioned several times earlier, I think it's a terrible idea to give control over life and death to an AI, and the book agrees with it, but their solution is of course putting human error into it, when in practice they actually already have handed over the power over life and death to an AI. So we're already in that situation. And then we get into the particulars, the gleaning itself. So since there are no set rules other than the quotas, every single scythe makes up their own rules about how to go about killing people. So there's really zero accountability. People revere scythes in this universe. Because they are held to a higher standard than anyone else, they don't have to pay for things, they can go wherever they want, people fear them, people are sycophants. By the way, the word sycophant and sycophantic is used quite inflationary. It's like you turn 3 pages and there's either the word obsequious or sycophantic. Guess the author just learned a new word prior to writing this book. But I digress, I shouldn't throw this much shade. So you might think, well, how do scythes kill other people? Do they give them a week's notice or something for the people to put their affairs in order? Do they, are they like executioners who very professionally give a lethal injection or sit them down in an electric chair or guillotine them, something humane? No, actually they don't. They use whatever they have available to them. There's even a scene where a flamethrower is used on a group of people. Of course, this is handled in a critical way. There is a Scythe called Scythe Volta who just goes too far, even by the book standards, because he employs mass gleanings. He waits all year long, and then he kills a bunch of people at the same time. Whereas other people, they're very respectful. They glean like 2 persons a week. I don't know what exactly their quotas are, and it's not exactly revealed. But let's just say they pace themselves a lot better than Volta. Now, Volta is also unusually cruel with his methods of execution, makes the people suffer, and is a perfect psychopath. And that, again, is a problem with Scythedom in general. You have people who enjoy the killing doing the killing. And that is just a bad idea, Maybe it would be a good idea to use your AI to kill people. The scenes in which Scythes come to people's homes look like they are directly lifted from medieval or even earlier ideas of death coming to your doorstep. Knock knock, who's there? It's death. Death who? Death you. I'm sorry for that. And there's a palpable atmosphere of dread in the air whenever a Scythe comes to someone's home, because generally it's because someone will get gleaned. Because the book wants it that way. Scythes as well are deliberately obtuse about their motives and their methods of engagement. Of course, the book tries to remedy that. Every single Scythe has to be held accountable. They have to write little journals in which they write something. And of course, there are too many Scythes to reliably know what their modus operandi is of every single one. Again, it would be a lot easier to have a unified and codified way in which they would kill people, because then you would know what you expect. Instead, you have this cruel situation in which someone will show up and you have no idea if he's one of the good Scythes or the bad Scythes, and if he will take joy in killing or if he will make it quick. You don't know which method of killing he will use. You do not know how much time you will have left. The book begins with a scene where our character Citra, her name by the way is Citra Terranova, and her mother is called Jenny Terranova. I just find that utterly hilarious, but that has nothing to do with the book. Just her name, it's Terranova, New Earth. Jenny Terranova. And she lives in mid-America. So they're fictitious continents in the future. Doesn't matter really, but the names have gone all wonky, apparently. So she's quite young, and Scythe Faraday comes into her home, and everyone is utterly terrified, and he asks to eat. Of course, they provide him because, as I said, Scythes are revered. They have a bigger and grander standing than anyone else in this universe. They, like everyone else, of course, have been around for quite a considerable amount of time. They, too, can turn the corner, so you don't know how long they've been doing it. You might have someone who is a Scythe since yesterday. You might have someone who is a Scythe for 4 lifetimes. And you would have to think about the psychological implications of that. What does a life of unjust killing do to you? Of course it's just within the confines of the book, but we'll get into that later. It gets very, very muddy, at least on the moral side of things. And it should do. You are killing people because of overpopulation. Natural death is gone. You see, we have this perception of death and this avoidance of death as something that can happen to you, that can strike you just like that, like cancer. It is impartial. It is something that happens. It is You are the victim of circumstance. You're never the victim of a particular person. I cannot imagine a world in which you would have institutionalized executioners at random on the loose, going from door to door, knocking there, and you might die that day. That sounds like an absolute nightmare. Like, just terror. Like, I don't know, it's like the worst thing I've ever heard as a premise. And it's not discussed in that way. It's not a dystopian novel. It's not 1984 for young children. This is like, it is just a minorly flawed, just a slightly flawed system of an otherwise perfect utopian society, and I can't disagree more with that. But this is the way that this is being handled for the most part. Of course there's discussion of this, but never of the points I bring up. Never of the points that it must be utter agony for everyone even being visited by a scythe. And they should know that. And they abuse their powers wherever they can. And of course they would abuse their powers. Because you are a human plus. You're not just a regular human. You're a human with unlimited power and decisions over who can live or die. Within the book it is mentioned that the best scythes are the ones that don't want to kill. Then you have a conundrum. The people who do not want to kill are the best to be the ones who are killers, and the people who want to kill, they make the worst killers. You actually don't want someone who's very good at their job, because they might get overzealous and kill too many people and kill too indiscriminately. So you're actually torturing the scythes as well. People who do not want to kill other people are forced to do so by some sort of religious obligation. And now let me tell you one argument that just completely dismantles this book. It just utterly destroys it. Why do you go to someone's home, actively kill them, in front of their family perhaps? Why don't you just not revive them? And you know what? If you don't like that an AI is doing the decision making, just have the scythe sit in a room full of computers, like the content farming people, or people who fill in questionnaires for a living all day. I know it's very unglamorous, and it's not as cool to go into someone's house with a robe on. But just, oh, he fell in front of a train. Alright, he's not being revived. Or, this guy is going to turn the corner. Let's just have a failure in the proceedings. And everyone would know that, The sudden cruelty of death is an alleviating factor when it comes to responsibility. You don't have to hate the scythe or hate the system that has been forced upon you. It's just a random circumstance. You were going to die anyway, and just by chance you didn't get revived. That sounds just a lot more fair to me. And I can't see why it's not done. Just select who is not going to die. Of course that means that people could live in absolute safety for eternity. They could use the maximum amount of their life before they turn the corner, and they could be really paranoid about dying and never do anything risky. But then again, is that any different from the situation we're in right now, where people are not getting revived? I mean, you don't see people, unless of course they are having a psychological condition, barricaded in their homes and afraid of dying because there's no revival. There is actually no revival in our world, and we are taking quite some risks. It is just so baffling to me that this somehow is the world that they inhabit. And I know why it's done as well. It is the quintessential problem of bad writing. You see, you want to have the scene before you have the sense. You want a world in which people go from door to door and kill people, and have a cool little situation in which overly powerful people have a conversation with essentially death itself. And you never think about the consequences of that, or better ways to do that. And you shouldn't think about this, because this is purely fantasy. This is purely something that should happen. And again, I would levy my criticism against that, because it is fine to have an entertaining story that has a nonsensical premise, if that is all you're aiming for. But if your scope is having a philosophical discussion about death and immortality, and you want to make your readers feel like they are having that particular discussion, and the book does that, believe you me, then I just think it's wrong to have such a ill-conceived and not very well thought out premise. I think that just takes away incredibly from the book. To see how jarring this disconnect is, there is a chapter in the book that talks about how death has been defeated and people do not know what death is anymore. They live completely free and senseless lives. You see, if you can live several lifetimes, there of course is no urgency anymore to do something tomorrow. You might as well do it next week, next year, or even next lifetime. Doesn't matter. Learn an instrument, well, you don't have 80 years, you have infinity. So people have forgotten what death is. People are not afraid of death anymore. To illustrate this, there is a scene where someone, for fun, kills themselves only to get revived again. It's a sport where they come from. So they are so disconnected from death that they have no concept of it. This is something that is said within the book. It is actually true. But then the Scythes come in and everyone is grovelling at their feet. They are sycophantic. They are absolutely terrified of the idea of death. Wait a second. I thought they had no concept of death. That's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? Now let me explain to you what's going on there. You see, they have no concept of death, yet they know that there are people out there who glean other people, so there is death. So how can they have no concept of death if there is death? Of course, death is a lot more uncommon, but you can't tell me that nobody has an uncle who has a brother or a sister of someone who has been gleaned. Ever. Everybody knows someone who has died. Because death is still a thing, because people still are gleaned. So how is it that nobody in your universe does not know what death is, if death still is around, albeit in a very different and more gruesome form? It makes no sense. And this is what I mean by you ought not to think too hard about young adult premises. I'm probably talking for 20 minutes about the premise of a book that has just been, like a random thought in someone's head. And he just thought, what, might make a good young adult novel series. And that's where that discussion ended. And I'm just thinking about this. Why and how and it makes no sense, and oh my god, am I in the wrong for not making sense of it? It's just baffling. It's just utterly amazing how stupid the very premise is. I haven't even gotten into the book. Just the premise is just so insane. It's so insane, inadequate for any human to live. And then you get into the particulars. In the very first scene I already described, where he goes into Citra Terranova's house, he demands something to eat. He never makes it clear that he's not there to kill anyone. He rather revels in the idea that they are absolutely fearful of him. At least, in my opinion, it's made out that way. He might as well just be mysterious for mysterious sakes. That's also a possibility. But then again, if you are in a world where Scythes are feared, then it would be rather cruel to not tell them that you're not there for them, because he was there for their neighbours. He takes a knife out of their kitchen and goes over to kill the neighbour. I think that is, again, and I'm going to say it again, and I know it's redundant, but it is unusually cruel. He is going to be stabbing someone to death. Again, just don't revive them. Just use a more humane way of killing them. And there's such a flimsy reasoning for why this is done. You see, there's a reference to the olden days, the days where death was still a thing. And he says, I kill in a multitude of ways to emulate how death once was. When death was a naturally occurring thing, of course people got stabbed sometimes. Of course people got killed in car crashes sometimes. People got electrocuted sometimes. So I'm going to emulate this by electrocuting, stabbing, and crushing people. I don't know. I don't know how anyone is okay with this in this particular universe, but they are. They are. It's like just this bizarre world in which everyone thought that is a very good idea to do. Just give a cult of people arbitrary power and have them kill you at random. This particular premise is being laid out by excerpts in between the chapters. They're excerpts from the journals that the Scythes are required to keep, and they explain some of the surrounding factors of this world. In particular, that there are audits for who you glean. You have to get a quota. You can't have you can have killed too few people, but you also can't kill too many people. You can't be overzealous. You can't, of course, be underzealous. And this brings a very interesting idea into the particulars of things. You see, if you have a very high population growth, and of course in the perfect utopian future you wouldn't have as many kids, because, you know, as the logarithmic curve comes to a closing, fewer and fewer people are born. So realistically you wouldn't have to kill, you know, that many people to maintain a population. But still it would be a considerable amount of people that you would have to kill, because you see, there are generally only always 3 generations active, generally speaking. So once you grow up, you want to have kids because you are biologically inclined to have them. Of course, some people don't, but they are naturally selected out. Of course, they're not anymore, but people generally, let's just say after 100,000 years of human evolution, people generally want to have kids, and they do have them. And a large portion of your populace will have children. And after 3 generations and the absence of death, your grandfather does not die anymore. And you have a grand-grandfather and a grand-grand-grandfather. Do that for a few generations and you will see that you will have quite the amount of people. If no one dies off, your population will increase so incredibly fast. It's actually insane. So the idea that you have like every Scythe has like in the hundreds of people he has to kill every year, and I think in the book it was like in the low hundreds that one Scythe had to kill a year. Just think about how many scythes you would need and how impossible a task accountability would be for them. You couldn't even have one person know all of the names of them, because of course scythes are everywhere, not just in Mid-America, but they are all over the world, because all over the world people are born, people die. Let's just suppose you plateau at 8 billion people, and if only half of the population, which is a very conservative guess, has children, then you would have 4 billion people to glean. So to actually maintain a stable population, you would have to kill 4 billion people, which is 1/3 of your then population. So 1 in 3 people has to die at that point. Of course, you could make the argument, as I already made, that since it's logarithmic, you know, population growth, and it's a very advanced future, fewer and fewer people will have children, and less of them will have 2. But then again, we are losing something very important. Brothers and sisters don't exist anymore, and that is kind of sad. But, you know, might be the future we live in. But even at a very low fraction of people reproducing, like 1/4, 1/8 of the population reproducing, it is still too many people to kill. So just as a numbers game, you would have a Herculean task of killing people. And then again, the very idea of death not being a factor anymore just is completely ludicrous, because if 1/3 of your population dies, or be it 1/4, 1/5, 1 in 5 people have died. How many people do you know? You know, 80 people? Okay, that means that you at least know 15 people who have died. More like 17. Math is bad. The very idea of being an immortal society is worth exploring. It's a very interesting thought experiment. I'm just saying, it's just done so poorly. And again, it is because the idea of the cool scene comes before the sense. Instead of making a good story and have interesting scenes happen in them, you have interesting scenes and try to cobble them together into a story. And that is the epitome of bad writing. So let's get into the particulars. I've got my Kindle out once more, and let's let the words of the author speak for themselves. So here is Scythe Curie, named after Marie Curie, and this is an excerpt from her gleaning journal. I had my cultural audit today. It happens only once a year, but it's never any less stressful. This year, when they crunched each cultural index from those I've gleaned over the past 12 months, I, thankfully, came up well within accepted parameters. 20% Caucasoid, 18% Afric, 20% Pan-Asian, 19% Meso-Latino, and 23% other. Sometimes it's hard to know. A person's index is considered private, so we can only go by visible traits, which are no longer as obvious as they had been in past generations. When Scythe's numbers become lopsided, they are disciplined by the High Blade, and are assigned their gleanings for next year rather than being allowed to choose for themselves. It is a sign of shame. The index is supposed to keep the world free from culture and genetic bias, but aren't there underlying factors that we can't escape? For instance, who decided that the first number of one's genetic index would be Caucasoid? From the Gleaning Journals of H.S. Curie. Let's talk about that. First of all, virtual signaling. Very interesting discussion about racial biases, that in itself the way in which the index is written might as well be biased. I don't think it's particularly important which race comes first, but of course it's very interesting that Caucasoid comes before Afric. Again, an interesting observation by the character within the universe. But apart from that, what is that saying? It is saying that since the genetic indexes, which is something that is in universe used to describe their genetic makeup and their ethnicity, is private, so they have to go by looks. So they are literally being racist. They have to look at someone's skin color and hope that they have the right index, else they are gleaning wrong. This is so bad. It is actually so bad. The system is flawed on so many levels, and people have to do guesswork to kill people. Wouldn't it be easier to just have a computer pick people at random? True random, really, just true random. Just take some noise, maybe some background radiation from the universe, put it through a few hashes, and then have that random set of data pick people, and that's that. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be a situation which is infinitely more fair than what they are doing? They have to actually audit people and call them in if they accidentally killed the wrong skin-colored people, because they have no scientific means of killing them correctly. And who's to say that they have to glean them in that particular way, since populations can differ? There's only 10% Afrik in your population. What do you do then? Do you still have to kill 18% Afrik people? Or does it take representation into account? It is once again just completely baffling to me how anyone could think this would be an okay system to run your death on. So let's move away from the premise and let's talk briefly about the actual plot of the book. So there's Rowan and Citra, both young, plucky teenagers who have stood up to the Scythe Faraday. So when Scythe Faraday came in to glean someone they knew, in Citra's case it was their neighbor, in Rowan's case it was someone at his high school, and they both were very anti-Scythe and anti-gleaning. They both thought it was an injustice of immeasurable proportions, i.e. the only two rationally thinking people in the entire book, but whatever. And he really liked that. They had this morally superior view of things, and they were not afraid to spit in his face, essentially, while everyone else was groveling at his feet and being sycophantic and crawling backwards towards them. I'm sorry for putting that image into your head. They were morally steadfast, and they said, no, this is wrong, I don't want you to arbitrarily kill people, I have morals. And he thinks, you know what, these kids have morals, let's make them complicit and make them Scythes. Well, that particular thing aside, they both accept, both for their own reasons. Of course, you can also grant immunity. As a Scythe, you have a ring, and kissing the ring puts you into a DNA database in which you are granted, drumroll, 12 months of immunity. 1 entire year in which you can be completely sure that you will not be gleaned. Again, I have to remind you that within the book it is said that this is a society that does not know what death is, and they bend over backwards for Scythes and want immunity for 1 year. So if everyone is this concerned about having just 1 year of guaranteed not death, then how is it that they do not have a concept of death? Again, it makes no sense. I don't know why this is written this way. It is so frustrating for me. Really, I'm really trying to be neutral here, but had they just taken this out, I can accept, actually I can't accept this particular society, but let's just say I can accept the idea of this society. If the premise was, we have just shifted death from one location to another, and people are now, instead of they are afraid of death and naturally occurring death and accidents, they are afraid of scythes. That would be okay. That would be okay. But no, he wants to have it both ways. It's a deathless society. Nobody knows what death is, but at the same time, they absolutely relish the idea of having 1 year of not death, even though they don't know what death is. I don't know, it's just all over the place. It makes no sense. It's not good philosophy. Again, it's just because they want to have certain scenes, and they want to have certain premises, and they want the Scythe to have a certain standing in society, so that you can have your power fantasy for young people. And this is the entire reason why this exists. And I'm very ashamed that this has worked for so many people. But back to the plot of the book. So, they both become Scythes. Both of them are being trained by Honourable Scythe Faraday, but unfortunately, a Scythe can only ever have one apprentice. So him having two is against the rules, and there are other Scythes within the Scythedom, within the order, that campaign against him having two apprentices. So the only really recourse he has is, of course, he can only ever train one, and he will make them fight at the end. And the winner has to glean the loser. So this, of course, puts a lot of strain on the relationship between Rowan and Citra, now that they are sworn enemies and one has to die by the hand of the other, which is again a very nice trope. Understandably, the relationship isn't as sunshine and rainbows anymore. I imagine this is very accurate. If I was told I had to inevitably kill or be killed by my future girlfriend, I probably wouldn't be as enamored with her anymore. So, points for realism. In the end, Scythe Faraday feigns his death, and his apprentices have to be sent to other Scythes. Rowan has to go to Scythe Volta, who is just kill hungry. I'm doing the motions of a flamethrower. Who's killing all of the people at once, and he gets into a very dark place, whereas Citra is with the morally superior Scythe Curie, who tells her all about her gleaning and her superior ways of doing it, because she uses a set of standards that's just that much higher than any other Scythe. And in the end they fight each other. I think Citra wins, and she has to do a final test, in which she has to kill her own brother, and when she passes that, she is to be the winning Scythe, and she has to glean Rowan, and she punches him with her ring hand, and he gets 1 year of immunity accidentally, and then he escapes from this huge congregation of Scythes, where they wanted to do the ritual of swearing in the new Scythe. And she picks the name Scythe Anastasia, which makes no sense, but we'll get into the particular book thing right now. The High Blade, the leader of the Scythes, actually has some problems with her picking the name of Scythe Anastasia. He says, "I can't say this is an appropriate choice. The Tsars of Russia were known more for their excess than their contribution to civilization, and Anastasia Romanov did nothing of note in her short life." Citra, of course, replies, "Exactly why I chose her, Your Excellency. She was the product of a corrupt system, and because of that was denied her very life, as I almost was. Had she lived, who knows what she might have done. Perhaps she could have changed the world and redeemed her family name. I choose to be Scythe Anastasia. I vow to become the change that might have been." The High Blade held her gaze and held his silence. Then one Scythe rose and began applauding. Scythe Curie. Then another one joined her, and another, and soon the entire Scythedom was on their feet in an ovation for the newly ordained Scythe Anastasia. This is the Tumblr version of a book. Everyone clapped. Well, Here's the problem. Firstly, she spits into the face of this particular system, of the Scythedom, and tells everyone with her 17-year-old self that this system is completely retarded, she doesn't want it, and she is against it. She calls herself Scythe Anastasia, not you have to say the naming convention within the Scythes is that you take important historic figures called the historic patrons or patrons historic, I don't know the particular term anymore, but they reject their birth names and take on these new names and as Scythes. This is why you have the names like Faraday, Volta, Curie, and the other, I think the High Blade is called Xenocrates. So they use important historical figures to be Scythes. Now, one immediate problem with that is a technical one, and that is that she's not called Scythe Romanov, which she should be called, but she's called Scythe Anastasia. It's always the last name. There's no instance in which a first name is used, unless the person is only known by a singular name, such as Socrates. But she has two names. It's called Anastasia Romanov, and she's not called Scythe Romanov. Instead, she's called Scythe Anastasia, just so she can be Scythe Anastasia. And it's just a trope. Your character is called Anastasia. Ugh, why did that happen? Again, doesn't really take away from the story, I'm just saying. Makes no sense. It's again a special exception for her. What is important, however, is that she is very disrespectful against the system that is obviously flawed, and she's the only one that notices that the system is flawed. And this is a recurring theme within the book. And it is again the power fantasy of young people, because they of course know everything about life way better, and all systems are corrupt, and of course they are obviously corrupt, and only young people can see that. So to illustrate this particular trait within the story, let's talk about the scenes in which Faraday first encounters his two apprentices. The first one I've already talked in length about, of Citra, who has been just a little loudmouth within her home as Faraday came into it. And she, of course, challenged him. He challenged him, why do people need to die? Why do you kill people? Yada, yada, yada. And the other situation is where Rowan comes to school, and the Scythe asks him where the principal's office is, and he brings him there, and the high school quarterback is being called out. Everyone is as white as a sheet. The principal leaves his own office and has the young quarterback and the Scythe enter. And they're both, as I said, they're both as pale as a sheet. They have no spine, no backbone. But you know what? Rowan thinks it's wrong that he has to face this alone. So he goes into the room with them. He has selected for his method of execution electrocution. So he has a little hand shocker, which is like a little prank thing, but it's deadly. So that's a lot of fun. And it would immediately stop his heart. And the quarterback character is incredibly scared, and he's very thankful that Rowan is there and gives him moral support. And that again just shows how unusually cruel this is. There's no way you can say goodbye to your family. It's just a sudden, you have planned death. It's not like, you could tell people something. You could write a manifesto or something. You could say, you know what, in 1 month you're going to die, and it's inevitable. Like people who have cancer. I know it's a bad thing that people die, but they at least have time. They have time to prepare themselves, and it's a very different thing than just being called into your principal's office and being electrocuted. It's just so damn cruel. It's insane. The quarterback's name is Cole. Let me just read the scene in entirety, because it's just baffling, and the entire book is like this. "You can't do this to me," Cole begged. "My parents will die. They'll just die." "No, they won't," the Scythe corrected. "They'll live on." "Can you at least give him a few minutes to prepare?" Rowan asked. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" "I'm asking you for some mercy." The Scythe glared at him again, but this time it was somehow different. He wasn't just delivering intimidation, he was extracting something, studying something in Rowan. "I have done this for many years," the Scythe said. "In my experience, a quick and painless cleaning is the greatest mercy I can show." Then at least give him a reason. Tell him why it has to be him. It's random, Rowan, Cole said. Everyone knows that. It's just freaking random. But there was something in the Scythe's eyes that said otherwise, so Rowan pressed. There is more to it, isn't there? The Scythe sighed. He didn't have to say anything. He was, after all, a Scythe, above the law in every way. He owed no one an explanation, but he chose to give one anyway. And then he goes to say that since there have been automobile-related incidents and the quarterback was a risk group, he just randomly selected him to be the victim of an imaginary car crash. Of course, he just goes there and electrocutes him. So, in his last moments, he begs to have his hand held. The Scythe warns him and says that he might get electrocuted too. And he says, that's a risk I'm willing to take. I can go to the revival center after all, and then, just so he's not alone. And Scythe thinks that's okay. That's a fine, human, compassionate thing to do, and kills the Cool character. And Rowan just flies backwards through all of the electricity and the shock, and he wakes up shortly thereafter, being healed by his nanites and his bloodstream. And yeah, again, the character of the Scythe itself, who is being built up as this wise old man, acknowledges how very vastly morally superior this character is. So he says to the Rowan character says to the Scythe, "Thank you for letting me stay." The Scythe regarded him a little too long and then said, "You stood your ground for a boy you barely knew. You comforted him at the moment of his death, bearing the pain of the jolt. You bore witness, even though no one called you to do so." Rowan shrugged. "I did what anyone would do." "Did anyone else offer?" the Scythe put to him. "Your principal? The office staff? Any of the dozen students we passed in the hall?" "No," Rowan had to admit. "But what does it matter what I did? He's still dead, and you know what they say about good intentions." The Scythe nodded and glanced down at his ring, sitting so fat on his finger. "I suppose now you'll ask me for immunity." Rowan shook his head. "I don't want anything from you." So, if you're 17, you might think that is exactly what you would do, when in fact, this is a daydream. This is something you'll think about when you are in class, and the teacher is being incredibly boring with your history exam or maths or something like that. And you just think, you know what, if someone came through this room right now and tried to glean, Stacy, I would hold her hand and I would be there for her. I would do that because I'm just such a good person. I would be that. I would be the change. When in reality, someone came in and did that, it would be like, don't look at me. It's not me. The cowardice. The actual reality of the situation. The actual reality of the situation is a lot more interesting than a make-believe hypothetical. I like the exploration of human nature as much as anyone does, and I can tell you that this is wholly unrealistic. Does it matter that it's unrealistic? Yes, it does, because it sets you up with wrong expectations about how the world works. It is rarely so that any moral situation is as clean-cut as this, and even if it was, you wouldn't act correctly, and you have to know that. You have to know that so you can act correctly. You have to overcome your own cowardice. Else you live in this false world of saying, I'm a good person. I'm a good person. You know who killed all the Jews in World War II? People who consider themselves good persons. Do some soul searching. And this is the problem I have with these particular messages. You're 17. You're idealistic. You're young. You know nothing about the world. And you think you have it all figured out. These two people are the only two in the entire book who think that anything is wrong with the system. Of course, the Scythes themselves have some things to say about it, and they have a moral discussion about it, but they all deem it generally necessary that people die, and that they do their job very well. There's also something to say about that they think that the Scythedom is in some way corrupt. People like Volta come around and kill people en masse. So it's even more important for them to do the job correctly. It's sort of like this idea of the prison guard in a corrupt system who just does a good job, and he supports the system because he himself believes if he did not do his job well, someone else would come and do it worse. Again, it's faulty logic and it's false reasoning, but I can understand where they're coming from generally. It's just if you have like 4 lifetimes to think about that particular thing, I think at some point you would stand up to power, especially since he does regard this as a virtue, but he himself does not do it. He himself does not try to stir around in the Scythedom. He complies to it in every situation. And of course, he does, he does kind of like shake the cage, rattle the cage a little bit here and there. But in general, he does do his job very diligently. So he is well ingrained within the system. So it falls to our protagonists, our young 17-year-old girls and boys, to actually show the world that they know better. They know better than the people who did this for their entire life. And I think that is an atrocity. It is, in essence, just a simple power fantasy for young people. It is everything I hate about young adult and why I hate it. It is not a fair discussion about how you would act or how you should act. It is just a popcorn moral dilemma which is easily solved by morally superior characters in a world that is utterly insane, so they look better. It's like a superhero movie, but worse. Because with a superhero movie, you at least know that you're going to fictional territory. With literature, it is, of course, in some ways you are being taken on a journey, on an exploration of an interesting idea. And because a world is as vividly painted as here, that you would somehow be able to navigate it flawlessly. And it's never explored. That you might be as complicit as the next person within it. No, you are the glorious protagonist. You are the glowing example of everything that is right within the world. And this is what this book is trying to tell you. To highlight this, there's another scene which makes utterly no sense whatsoever. Since Citra has to kill her brother, she of course protests because it's wrong to kill your family members. And she says, "How can you do this to people? My dear," Scythe Mir would practice patience, "it's not a gleaning because you're not yet a Scythe. You merely have to render him deadish. An ambudrone will take him to be revived as soon as you complete the task we've put before you. So your brother is not going to die. She just has to kill his body." "But he'll remember!" "Yes," said Scythe Mandela, "and so will you." One of the other Scythes she did not know crossed his arms and huffed, much the way she had done on the drive here. "She's too resistant," he said. "Let her go. This night's already gone on too long." "Give her time," said Scythe Mandela sternly. So, again, look, she's so morally superior without taking into account and into context the entire world we have built up, where death is seen merely as an annoyance. It is very, very difficult for her to kill her brother, especially since she has killed before. The thing is, she has killed before. She did kick someone in front of a train, I believe, and she's very self-conscious about this. She really thinks she's a bad person because of it. But again, death has no consequence in this universe. Of course, it's a bit expensive to get revived, I believe, but again, the system just takes care of it. And it's so lacking of any consistency in this particular regard, When the book needs consequences, death is permanent and something that is very bad. When it is not, it is something that is a fun exploration of how bodies can get destroyed and mangled in various ways. It does not make the slightest resemblance of any sense. And this is played out in this particular scene as well. You want her to be this high moral character who does not want to kill her brother because it is painful and traumatic to him, because she does not want to inflict pain on him, because death is something that is generally undesirable. But then again, death is something that is utterly without consequence, and it can just happen, and it will fulfill her journey into destiny, into Scythedom, and she can grant immunity to her brother after it, and she cannot comprehend that. For her, it is just emotionally wrong to kill him, and that would be fine if that was the only statement that this particular scene was trying to make, but it's not. It is said that everyone is dulled to the idea of death, and that should include her, but it doesn't. For some reason, she's opposed to it. She's opposed to a minor setback in his body, and I don't know. And it's not explored in any other capacity. You see, since death is so consequenceless, and she seems to be the only person in this entire universe that thinks it is wrong to kill someone. With kill, I of course mean not actually cleaning them, but to, render their body useless. And again, that is not explained why. It's just assumed that we know that it is wrong. Of course we say, well, it's wrong. Of course it's wrong to kill people. But the book makes you believe that we live in a future where nobody actually knows what death is. And if that were the case, then, sibling fighting would be a lot more interesting. Can you just imagine? Mom, I killed my brother again. And, she just rolls her eyes and she's like, oh my god, now I have to go to the revival center. Can you just not kill your brother for one day? But again, the book tries to have it every which way. And it's not consistent. And it is not meant to be thought about. It is just meant to be consumed. And I think as a young person and as someone who writes for young people, you should have more respect for them. So if you write for them, you should have more respect for them. And if you read, you should have more respect for yourself. That does not mean that you have to be at the very pulse of society every single book you read. It can be quite jarring. I have read Fyodor Dostoevsky, and I have to say it was a very difficult read, so something light-hearted in between is fine. But please have some standards. The very premise is in opposition to things that are said within the book. It has no internal consistency or logic, and scenes just happen because the scenes need to happen. And this is quintessentially why I dislike most young adult. They think it is a lesser standard because it's for younger people. But I say that these young, impressionable minds have to be fed with something that has some value, that is written competently. I want them to respect the reader's mind. You can still have a fun story. You can even have a story that is somewhat of a power fantasy for a character and still have them make difficult real-life decisions. You can absolutely play this up as a conflict between her wanting to achieve something and her going mad with power, this idea of I can kill everyone I want to, and she's a young, impressionable person, and you just put herself in her place, and you think, whoa, that's crazy. And her not wanting to kill her brother, and you think, well, I'm kind of torn between this idea, because everything I want is barred behind me killing him, and I really don't want to kill him. And I just want it so much, and I'm just gonna do it, and bam! But she doesn't even want to be a Scythe, She's appalled by it. So why does she even do it? Why does she even become a Scythe? It makes really just little sense. We are constantly bordering on the fringes of sense with every single decision that's being made in this book, and I don't think it makes for a good read. I just want my characters to have some consistency and some flaws. They are both shown to be some very skilled fighters. In the end, where the Scythes think that this was a very big sleight of hand that she made him kiss the ring and granted him immunity, they talk about imprisoning him for 1 year so they can eventually just have him be killed, and he just escapes just like that because he's just that skilled of a fighter. People who train all their lives to effectively slice and dice through all of their gleaned victims are unable to stop a young boy who has just completed his training. It's in a way, it's just there's no learning in it. There's no learning experience. They know everything. They know how to act morally, they know how to fight. There's really no growth in it. And I think that is the worst crime that young adult does. There's no growth in it, and there should be growth, and there should be a focus on growth. They should do things wrong in the beginning and right at the end. They shouldn't be the perfect arbiters of every moral decision and physical confrontation throughout the entire book, and this is just what this is. And therefore I hate it, and therefore young adult needs to die. And therefore, this series, Young Adult Crusader, exists. I will have my personal crusade against young adult, against bad young adult, however. I will, of course, also introduce you to some young adult things I think are great and work very well. I have been talking about this for quite some time, so I will stop this for now. So, Scythe by Neal Shusterman, the very first book. I did not like it, for the reasons I said. I think it has problems. I think the very premise is flawed, and I have no idea how this has gained a following. But I also don't hate you if you like it. If you found some value in this book, then the book has served its purpose. Someone has crafted this book. Someone has made this book. So it can be enjoyed, and it should be enjoyed. I'm just imploring you to have higher standards. My name is Drewlik. You've been watching the Young Adult Crusade. Have a good one. I've got another one for BookTube. He put the ring away, and Rowan let out his breath, not even realizing he had been holding it.